Continuing now with The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. We finished chapter 15 in the last session, so now we begin with chapter 16 today. At the White House, the announcement of the president's journey to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Israel, and Jordan had been made in 5 separate press releases to meet traditional Arab objections to appearing on the same piece of paper as Israel. Bill Hinkle, chief of the advance crew, was in the Middle East trying to cram several months' preparations into a week. The precautions for the trip had to be extraordinary. Secret Service and CIA intelligence indicated that terrorists might try to kill the president. From Nixon's vantage point, the Middle East looked better and better compared to Washington. All he needed now was a good send-off. That had been left in the hands of his friend Rabbi Korf. 1,400 people were gathered in the Regency Ballroom of the Shoreham Hotel on Sunday afternoon, June 9th, for a testimonial luncheon sponsored by the National Citizens Committee for Fairness to the Presidency. As they waited for the president to arrive, Republican Senator Carl T. Curtis of Nebraska told them, "The Get Nixon crowd, including those who conduct a trial by press, are in for a big surprise." The audience cheered lustily. The ambassador to Italy, John Volpe, brought them to their feet. "You just look at this Nixon family," he said. "They are a close-knit family." Pins were presented to the Nixon daughters. Mrs. Nixon was honored as a defender of the American family. Tricia told the audience, "You will be in our hearts all the days of my father's presidency, 965 more days." At 3:05 p.m., the president arrived and was welcomed by thunderous applause. He proceeded carefully. He built his case for support of the presidency, not of himself. "Tomorrow, as you know, Mrs. Nixon and I will start a very long journey of 15,000 miles in which we will visit 5 nations, 4 of which have never been visited by a president of the United States before." The rally on the eve of that journey, he said, would, quote, "be long remembered, not only by the president, but by all future presidents for whom you are working." He listed past triumphs: ending the Vietnam War, opening relations with China, achieving détente with the Soviet Union. He turned to his even greater ambitions. "I can assure you that the hope for building a peaceful world rests in the leadership of the United States, and that leadership, of course, rests in the hands of whoever may be president. I shall do nothing to weaken this office while I am holding this office." He was interrupted by cheering. "God bless Nixon," the crowd shouted. "One final personal thought," the president said, and he quoted a letter written to a White House stenographer by her boss. "We have been together ever since we came to Washington in 1969 as part of this great adventure on January 20th of that year, and we shall leave heads high on January 20th, 1977. The crowd roared. Tricia and Edward Cox stood to his left, Rabbi Korf on the right. He lifted his right arm and formed the familiar victory sign. As he left the podium, he was limping slightly. The next morning, as Air Force One headed for Salzburg, Austria, Henry Kissinger was still brooding. He was with Eagleburger and Scowcroft in the spacious staff quarters just behind the president's private cabin. They could see how terribly worn Kissinger looked. Scowcroft thought Nixon's trip should have been postponed for 6 weeks or so to give Kissinger time to recover from his exhausting month in the Mideast. The wiretapping accusations had frazzled him. But the president wanted to get out of the country to strike the pose of world peacemaker. Kissinger's problems would just have to wait. But the allegations were serious. The House Judiciary Committee now had copies of all the FBI's raw files about the taps. They contained memos that were bound to implicate Kissinger even further. Some quoted Haig as saying that Kissinger had requested certain taps personally, and that Kissinger had told the FBI that whoever leaked information to the press should be destroyed. Kissinger had visited bureau headquarters to read transcripts of the tapped conversations. Aboard the plane, Kissinger told his aides that he saw an endless attack being mounted against him. Eagleburger and Scowcroft both recognized that Kissinger had shaded the truth in his testimony. They searched for a solution. Eagleburger had already proposed to Kissinger that he'd hold a press conference to denounce the stories and threatened to resign if necessary. Scowcroft had opposed it. There had been relatively few stories, he said. Threatening resignation would indicate that Kissinger was overly sensitive on the subject. It would suggest that he was covering up. But Kissinger was coming around to Eagleburger's view. He couldn't ignore the attack. Sooner or later it would have to be answered. In the hands of the 38 members of the House Judiciary Committee, the FBI documents would be leaked in the most unfavorable light. Perhaps it was time to go on the offensive. Henry, then do it, Eagleburger told him. Kissinger went forward to see Haig. I've had enough. It's got to be met head on, he told the general. He did not mention that he might threaten resignation, only that he was considering a press conference. Haig took the matter to the president. When he came back, he indicated that Nixon was concerned that a press conference might distract attention from the president's mission. Perhaps Kissinger should think it over. Ziegler was even less pleased and suggested that Kissinger take the standard White House line of denial, quote, I won't dignify it with comment. But when the plane landed in Austria, the party learned of another unfavorable story, as well as an editorial in the New York Times. And the State Department press office saw more coming. Boiling, Kissinger stayed up until nearly dawn, talking with Eagleburger and Scowcroft and with advisors back in Washington. His mind was made up. They all recognized that if the stories continued full tilt, he might have to make good on a threat. A public threat to resign could be made only once. Kissinger needed to break the continuing chain of accusation and denial. He needed a grace period from attacks in the press. Mansfield had told him that he would be called before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to answer the new charges. Kissinger decided to preempt the committee. He would demand publicly that it open an inquiry into the accusations against him. That would force the attackers to pause. Hearings could not take place until after the Middle East trip. Kissinger's staff would have time to assemble the memos and documents that could be used to answer each of the accusations and support the secretary's version of events. He would be in an extremely sympathetic forum with senators who supported him and his policies. He drafted a letter to the Foreign Relations Committee. At 5 a.m. Salzburg time, members of the press office staff began knocking on the doors of reporters' hotel rooms. There would be a press conference first thing before breakfast. Filling into a cavernous room in Cavalier House. Most of them expected Kissinger to hold forth on his expectations for the presidential journey. He walked to the microphone. Last Thursday, a number of you commented on the fact that I seemed irritated, angered, flustered, discombobulated. All these words are correct, he said. He read his letter to the committee and expressed concern that he hadn't had an opportunity to respond fully to the accusations. The impression has been created that I was involved in some illegal or shady activity that I'm trying to obscure with misleading testimony. He laid out the situation from his perspective. In 1969, he was conducting sensitive negotiations. Leakers were endangering those negotiations. Some of his aides were suspect because of their ties to the previous administration. He had been told that prior administrations had conducted wiretaps to protect the national security. Accordingly, he had provided information on who had access to data that had been leaked. He had known that they would probably be tapped, but the president, not he, had initiated the wiretapping program. Though he found it distasteful, he had accepted it. He appealed for understanding. All of you in this room know from your profession that the truth very often has intangible aspects. And he deplored the climate in which, quote, unnamed sources can attack the credibility and the honor of senior officials of the government without even being asked to identify themselves, end quote. His aides cringed at that reference. They were all aware that Kissinger's credibility had been called into question by FBI memos, signed by Director J. Edgar Hoover himself, and by the president's own taped words, not by unnamed sources. Kissinger seemed on the verge of tears, and his voice choked as he talked about his place in history. When the record is written, one may remember that perhaps some lives were saved, and that perhaps some mothers can rest more at ease, but I leave that to history. What I will not leave to history is a discussion of my public honor. I believe that I should do what I could to heal divisions in this country. I believe that I should do what I could to maintain the dignity of American values, and to give Americans some pride in the conduct of their affairs. I can do this only if my honor is not at issue and if the public deserves to have confidence. If that cannot be maintained, I cannot perform the duties that I have exercised, and in that case I shall turn them over immediately to individuals less subject to public attack. The questions from the reporters indicated that they were skeptical. I want to make absolutely clear that I am not making this as a threat in order to gain support, Kissinger responded. I am stating an objective fact. It is impossible and incompatible with the dignity of the United States to have its senior official and to have its Secretary of State under this sort of attack, and in the face of the dangers we confront and the risks that may have to be run and the opportunities that may have to be seized. This is a fact. This is not a threat. One reporter wondered aloud if the same standard might be better applied to the president. The president is the only nationally elected official, Kissinger replied. For a president to resign under attack would raise the most profound issues of national policy, and in my judgment, a president can leave office only according to the constitutional processes that have been foreseen for it. Finally, Kissinger, Haig, and Ziegler strode in step from their room, their bearing grim and military. Minutes later, Kissinger stormed into his staff quarters. He hadn't wanted Kissinger to have a press conference, let alone threaten to resign. It was an inauspicious start for the president's trip. God damn it, he shouted. Again, the focus was on Kissinger, not the president. Once more, the attention was on administration scandal. How the hell could they divert attention from Watergate with Kissinger dragging it across the seas? Haig reported back to Kissinger on Nixon's reaction. Good job, and the president won't accept your resignation, he said. Haig was disturbed, however. This business was hurting his own credibility. He was the Kissinger deputy who had implemented each of the taps through the FBI. Kissinger's denials were bound to focus further attention on his own role. Clearly, he would be the key witness before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The central question would be who had initiated the taps, the president, Kissinger, or Haig. Watergate was engulfing the president, and now it was threatening Kissinger and himself. That evening, Kissinger dined with Scowcroft, Eagleburger, and Peter Rodman, his personal aide. The press conference had been cathartic. He replayed it between bites of Wiener Schnitzel. Was it the right thing to do? Had he said the right things? What would the reaction be? What would the Russians think? The reassurance of his aides helped. For the first time in his career, Kissinger had taken the sort of public gamble that had succeeded over the years for Richard Nixon. He sensed that it was Nixon's almost demonic courage that had made the president what he had become. Nixon was often as careless with power as a tightrope walker who downed 3 drinks before walking across the canyon, Kissinger thought. That was the quality of Nixon's leadership that he both admired and feared. Now he had adopted the same precarious stance himself. While most members of the presidential party concerned themselves with Richard Nixon's political life, Major General Walter Takacs, his personal physician, was worried about the president's life, period. During Nixon's years as vice president and president, Takacs had examined his principal patient regularly. Nixon was a healthy man generally, but not given to complaining about minor discomforts. Takacs relied on those around the president, particularly his valet, Manolo Sanchez, for information. It was unusual for the president to summon him on the spur of the moment as he did this day. Takacs hurried to Nixon's sitting room. The president greeted him perfunctorily and pulled up his left pant leg. Takacs could see that the leg was inflamed and swollen. He examined the leg more closely, then went through a series of checks which confirmed his fears. A blood clot had formed in a vein in the leg, he explained. Phlebitis. The clot could break loose and go to his heart or lungs. That could be fatal. Continuing the trip was a senseless risk, Takacs told him. Strain from extended standing, climbing stairs, long walks, even crossing his legs might free the clot. He recommended that the president be hospitalized immediately and after enough rest to ensure that the clot had stabilized, that he fly back to Washington for further treatment. The president rejected the advice. The purpose of this trip is more important than my life. I know it is a calculated risk. He was obligated to finish what he had started. Takacs gave him a support hose. Nixon tried it on. It was too uncomfortable, he said. The physician told him the only good news he could think of. His diet, at least, was proper for the illness. Leaving his patient, Takash hurried to Haig's room. He shook as he told him the diagnosis. "I am going to order him to go home," Takash said, and he bolted for the conference room where Bull and Henkel had established a temporary office. It was ornately decorated. Hitler had used the room during the war, carving up Europe on a map. Takash did not pause for pleasantries. "Does the president have a lot of standing to do? Will he have to go on any long walks? Will he encounter a lot of stairs?" The schedule called for Nixon to be on his feet extensively. The next day's schedule, Cairo, Henkel said, was particularly rough. There was a lot of standing, walking, climbing. "Is there any way we can change this?" Takash sounded scared. "No, it's too late," said Henkel. They paced back and forth to avoid being overheard by others in the room. Takash said that Nixon belonged in a hospital. He should never have made the trip. "The president has a death wish," he said. "He won't take my advice. He won't listen to me." He explained how death could be instantaneous if the clot broke free. Usually, Henkel and Bull made light of Takash's concern about the president's health. He was easily alarmed. They preferred to take the advice of Nixon's other physician, Rear Admiral William Lukash. One White House joke held that Takash carried 2 cures in his medical bag, a bottle of aspirin and Bill Lukash's phone number. But the president, meanwhile, had quietly summoned Lukash. It was the first time both doctors had accompanied him on a trip. Though he was sensitive to the danger of offending his senior physician, Nixon had more confidence in the younger man. Lukash seemed more precise and more sure of himself. His diagnosis was the same, and his warning equally dire. He, too, tried to convince the president to terminate the trip. Nixon was just as adamant with him. He issued his own order. No one was to mention his condition. It had to be kept absolutely secret. Its disclosure would further harm the objectives of his presidency. In Washington that evening, Whitehead and Buchan met with the new members of the transition team for the first time. Brian Lamb, Whitehead's assistant at the Office of Telecommunications Policy, Larry Lynn, a former aide to Kissinger at the NSC, Jonathan Moore, formerly an assistant to Rockefeller and then to Elliot Richardson. The 5 men sat around Whitehead's dining room table drinking Cokes. Buchan stated the problem. Some groundwork had to be done for Ford in the event that he had to take over the presidency on short notice. Ford himself would have nothing to do with such preparation. Accordingly, Buchan was acting on his own. Ford was not aware of the existence of the group. Buchan spoke of Ford as an old friend, decent and honest, but very limited in his knowledge of the presidency. Ford would literally need a notebook, Buchan said, one with tabs that would specify in simple steps each decision required of a new president. There was another problem. If Ford became president, he would be besieged by old political friends, each of them with ideas and advice on how to proceed. Ford had always been susceptible to such pressure, Buchan said. Former Secretary of Defense Laird's name was mentioned. Articulate, charming, and intelligent, all agreed. But he was also an incorrigible schemer who would approach the new president, if it ever came to that, with grandiose plans, they were certain. The transition group should find a way to shield Ford from his influence. Haig was still another obstacle. Already Ford had come to like and trust the Nixon chief of staff. Lynn and Moore in particular were concerned about this. Haig could not be trusted, Lynn said. The general's capacity to beguile and his position in the Nixon White House could pose dangers for Ford. Haig was the chameleon bureaucrat. Moore elaborated. The general was tired. He would quite naturally be preoccupied with justifying past behavior and associations. Men like Haig would never be able to give their total allegiance to the new president. The group decided that each member would write short papers on their areas of expertise: economics, National Security Council, the departments, etc. They estimated they had until early September to complete their work. There was one last item on the agenda: Nixon's legal future. They agreed that Ford needed to be protected from entreaties that Nixon receive preferential legal treatment upon leaving office. The outgoing president should be accorded respect, not harassment or vengeance. But the potential that someone might approach Ford for a deal was dangerous. The new president would have to be warned that such an attempt should be rebuffed. Whitehead walked Buchan out to his car to talk privately. What would happen if Nixon were impeached and convicted and then refused to leave office? Maybe the notion of the president resisting removal was not so absurd. Suppose he went crazy and tried to use the military to retain office. The two men wondered if perhaps they should raise the question with the Secretary of Defense, James Schlesinger. What if it became necessary to remove the president through the 25th Amendment's provision relating to incapacity to govern? They decided they were obliged to consider every possibility, no matter how remote, how unthinkable. And in a footnote, they add, under the 25th Amendment, the Vice President and a majority of the Cabinet can declare that the President is, quote, unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office, end quote, whereupon the Vice President would become President. However, if the President maintains that no inability exists, both houses of Congress decide the issue. A vote of 2/3 of the members of each house would be required to remove the President. And we're in the middle of chapter 16, and we've topped the 20-minute mark, so this is where we'll stop for this session, and we'll continue chapter 16 in the next one. Thank you for watching.